Economic Democracy by Major C.H. Douglas, Chapter 3. We are thus led to inquire into environment with a view to the identification, if possible, of conditions to which can be charged the development of servility on the one hand and the discouragement of possibly more desirable characteristics on the other. And in this inquiry it is necessary to avoid the real danger of mistaking effects for causes, and, further, to beware of seeing only one phenomenon when we are really confronted with several. For instance, that from the misuse of the power of capital, many of the more glaring defects of society proceed is certain. But in claiming that in itself the private administration of industry is the whole source of these evils, the socialist is almost certainly claiming too much, confounding the symptom with the disease and taking no account of certain essential facts. It is most important to differentiate in this matter between private enterprise utilizing capital and the abuse of it. The private administration of capital has had a credit as well as a debit side to its account. Without private enterprise backed by capital, scientific progress and the possibilities of material betterment based on it would never have achieved the rapid development of the past 100 years. And still more important at this time, only the control of capital, which on the one hand has degraded propaganda into one of the black arts, has on the other made possible such crusades against an ill-informed or misled public opinion as, for instance, the anti-slavery campaign of the early 19th century, or the parallel activities of the anti-sweating league at the present day. The very agitation carried on against capitalism itself would be impossible without the freedom of action given by the private control of considerable funds. The capitalist system, in the form in which we know it, has served its purpose, and may be replaced with advantage, but in any social system proposed, the first necessity is to provide some bulwark against a despotism which might exceed that of the trust, bad as the latter has become. In our anxiety to make a world safe for democracy, it is a matter of real urgency that we do not tip out the baby with the bathwater and, by discarding too soon what is clearly an agency which can be made to operate both ways, make democracy even more unsafe for the individual than it is at present. The danger which at the moment threatens individual liberty far more than any extension of individual enterprise is the servile state. The erection of an irresistible and impersonal organization through which the ambition of able men, animated consciously or unconsciously by the lust of domination, may operate to the enslavement of their fellows. Under such a system, the ordinary citizen might, and probably would, be far worse off than under private enterprise, freed from the domination of finance and regulated in the light of modern thought. The consideration of any return to isolated industrial undertakings is quite academic, since there is not the faintest probability of its occurrence, but that stage of development had undoubtedly certain valuable features which it would be well to preserve and revive. The large profit-making limited company which distributes its profits over a wide area is already rapidly displacing the family business, and, as will be seen, it is not alone in the profit-making aspect of its activities that its worst features lie. In attacking capitalism, collective socialism has largely failed to recognise that the real enemy is the will to power. The positive complement to servility of which Prussianism, with its theories of the supreme state and the unimportance of the individual, both of which are the absolute negation of private enterprise, is only the fine flower, and that nationalisation of all the means of livelihood, without the provision of much more effective safeguards than have so far been publicly evolved, leaves the individual without any appeal from his only possible employer, and so substitutes a worse, because more powerful tyranny for that which it would destroy. It is a most astonishing fact that the experience of hundreds of thousands of men and women in such departments as the post office, where real discontent is probably more general, and the material and the psychological justification for it more obvious than in any of the more modern industrial establishments, has not been sufficient to impress the public with the futility of mere nationalisation. This is not in any sense a disparagement of the excellent qualities of large numbers of government officials. It is merely an attempt to indicate the remarkable facility with which well-intentioned people will allow themselves to be hypnotized by a phrase. It is notorious that the state socialists of Germany, commonly known as the Majority Party, were of the greatest possible assistance to Junkerdom in carrying out its plans for a Prussian world hegemony. While in our own country, the bureaucrat and the Fabian have, on the whole, not failed to understand each other, and the explanation is simply that both, either consciously or unconsciously, assume that there is no psychological problem involved in the control of industry. Just as the syndicalist is with more justification apt to stress psychological to the exclusion of the technical aspect. Because the control of capital has given power the effect of the operation of the will to power, has been to accumulate capital in a few groups, possibly composed of large numbers of shareholders, but frequently directed by one man, and this process is quite clearly a stage in the transition from decentralized to centralized power. This centralization of the power of capital and credit is going on before our eyes, both directly in the form of money trusts and bank amalgamations, and indirectly in the confederation of the producing industries, representing the capital power of machinery. It has its counterpart in every sphere of activity, the coalescing of small businesses into larger, of shops into huge stores, of villages into towns, of nations into leagues, and in every case is commended to the reason by the plea of economic necessity and efficiency. But behind this lies always the will to power, which operates equally through politics, finance, or industry, and always towards centralization. If this point of view be admitted, it seems perfectly clear that to the individual it will make very little difference what name is given to centralization, Nationalisation without decentralised control of policy will quite effectively install the trust magnet of the next generation in the chair of the bureaucrat, with the added advantage to him that he will have no shareholders' meetings. One of the more obvious effects of the concentration of credit capital in a few hands, which simply means the centralisation of directive power, is its contribution to the illusion of the fiercely competitive nature of international trade. Although, as we shall see, in considering the economics of the increasing employment of machinery for productive purposes, this phenomenon has been confounded with one to which it is only indirectly connected. It may be point out one method by which this illusion is produced, and it is probably not possible to do so in better words than those used by Mr. J. A. Hobson in his Democracy After the War. Where the product of industry and commerce is so divided that wages are low while profits, interest and rent are relatively high, the small purchasing power of the masses sets a limit on the home market for most staple commodities. The staple manufacturers, therefore, working with modern mechanical methods that continually increase the pace of output, are in every country compelled to look more and more to export trade and to hustle and compete for markets in the backward countries of the world. Just as the home market was restricted by a distribution of wealth which left the mass of the people with inadequate power to purchase and consume, while the minority who had the purchasing power either wanted to use it in other ways or to save it and apply it to an increased production which still further congested the home markets, so likewise with the world markets. Closely linked with this practical limitation of the expansion of markets for goods is the limitation of profitable fields of investment. The limitation of home markets implies a corresponding limitation in the investment of fresh capital in the trades supplying these markets. Because capitalism per se is largely the instrument through which the will to power operates in the economic sphere, some examination of its methods is necessary. The accumulation of financial wealth through the making of profit is merely one of the uses or abuses of money. It is in this sense that capitalism is associated to a very great extent in the popular mind with the processes of manufacture, production and distribution, and it is in this sense that the word is here employed. The capitalist system is based fundamentally on the financial perversion of the so-called law of supply and demand, which involves a claim that there exists an intrinsic relation between need or requirement and legitimate price or exchange value, a statement which is becoming increasingly discredited and is negative in the limitation of monopoly values by common consent. In respect of public utility companies such as lighting, water and transportation undertakings, proceeding from an economic system based on this assumed relation. However, the capitalist producer only parts with his product for a sum in excess of that representing its cost to him, receiving payment through the agency of money in its various forms of cash and financial credit, which, so far as they are convertible, have been defined as any medium which has reached such a degree of acceptability that no matter what it is made of, and no matter why people want it, no one will refuse it in exchange for his product. So long as this definition holds good, it is obvious that the possession of money or financial credit convertible into money establishes an absolute lieu on the services of others in direct proportion to the fraction of the whole stock controlled, and further, that the whole stock of financial wealth, inclusive of credit, in the world should, by this definition, be sufficient to balance the aggregate book price of the world's material assets and prospective production. And generally, it is assumed that the banks regulate the figures of wealth by the creation of credits, broadly representing the mobilization value of these assets either in esse or in posse, such value being for financial purposes the transfer or selling price and bearing no relation to the usage value of the article so appraised. But for reasons which will be evident in considering the costing of production at a later stage of our inquiry, the book value of the world's stocks is always greater than the apparent financial ability to liquidate them, because these book values already include mobilized credits. The creation of subsidiary financial media in the form of further bank credits becomes necessary and results in the piling up of a system of figures which the accountant calls capital, but which are in fact merely a function of prices. The effect of this is, of course, to decrease progressively the purchasing power of money, or, in other words, to concentrate the lien on the services of others, which money gives, in the hands of those whose rate of increase is most rapid. Intrinsic improvements in manufacturing methods operate to delay this concentration in respect of industry. But the process is logically inevitable and, as we see, is proceeding with ever-increasing rapidity, and we may fairly conclude that the profit-making system as a whole and as now operated is inherently centralizing in character. With this concentration of financial power and consequent control, however, there is proceeding in industry another development, apparently contradictory in its results, but of the greatest importance in the consideration of the subject as a whole. During the period of transition between individual ownership and the company or trust management, and under the stress of competition for markets, it became of vital importance to cut down the selling price of commodities, not so much intrinsically as in comparison with competitors, and as a means to this end, standardization and quantity production in large factories are of the utmost importance, carrying with them specialization of processes, the substitution, wherever possible, of automatic and semi-automatic machinery for skilled workmanship, and the incorporation of the worker into a machine-like system of which every part is expected to function as systematically as a detail of the machine which he may operate. The objective has, to a considerable extent, been attained. The scientific management systems in factories, an outstanding instance of this policy, based on the researches of efficiency engineers such as Mr. F. W. Taylor and Mr. Frank Gilbreth, have resulted in a rate of production per unit of labour hundreds or even thousands % higher than existed before their introduction. As a bait for the worker, these methods have commonly been accompanied by systems of payment by results, such as the premium bonus system in its various forms as adopted by Halsey, Roman, Weir, etc., round which has ranged fierce controversy, since in the very nature of things, being based on the consideration of profit, they were unable to take into account the operation of broad economic principles. It is no part of the argument with which we are concerned to discuss such systems in detail, but any unprejudiced and sufficiently technical consideration of them will carry the conviction that while the immediate effect of their introduction was undoubtedly to raise earnings, and so apparently to delay the concentration of wealth, it was correctly recognized by the worker that his real wages tended to bear much the same ratio or even to fall in comparison with the cost of living, since the purchasing power of money in terms of food, clothes, and housing fell faster than his wages rose. Note that the settled policy of labour, acting presumably on the best advice it could get in its own interests, was to exercise a control over production by fixing its own standard of output irrespective of time. The situation created by the demand for munitions of all kinds during the war has, of course, profoundly modified this attitude, with the result that a temporary, very large increase in real earnings undoubtedly took place in 1915 and 1916, taking the form of a rapid distribution of stored commodities, but it is quite questionable whether this level is even approximately maintained, and with the cessation of the wholesale sabotage of war, it will unquestionably fall as economic distribution through wage systems becomes ineffective apart from actual scarcity. Quite apart, therefore, from all questions of payment, there has grown up a spirit of revolt against a life spent in the performance of one mechanical operation devoid of interest, requiring little skill, and having few prospects of advancement other than by the problematical acquisition of sufficient money to escape from it. The very efficiency with which factory operations have been sectionalized has resulted in a complete divorcement between the worker and the finished product, which is itself conducive to the feeling that he is part of a machine in the final output of which he is not interested. His foremen and departmental heads are, from the largeness of the undertakings, almost inevitably out of human touch with him, while all the well-known phenomena of bureaucratic methods contribute to maintain a constant state of irritation and dissatisfaction. And in all these things is the nucleus of a centrifugal movement of formidable force. Nor is this feature confined to industrial life. The connection between militarism and capitalism as vehicles for the expression of the will to power has frequently been pointed out. By the device of universal liability to military service, a general threat has been made operative which would appear ultima ratio regis to set the seal on the ability of authority to dictate the terms on which the existence of the individual can continue. But it is doubtful whether there ever was a time when this threat was held more lightly, and the disregard of consequences so widespread. It is not suggested that conscription, either military or industrial, is regarded with complacency. The exact opposite is, of course, the truth. But just for the reason that the whole conception of a militarist world is instinctively recognized as anachronism, so, just to that extent, is the determination to defeat at any cost schemes involving compulsion strengthen in the minds of a population normally acquiescent.